Years ago, I was having lunch at a restaurant following a church worship service on a Sunday, and this restaurant appeared to be a favorite of people who had gone to a church worship service on Sunday, filled with people who were dressed in ways that hinted that they had not been bicycling, but rather had been, for example, sitting in a pew somewhere. And I overheard a little snippet of the conversation at the table next to mine. There were these two women talking, and one said, where I was catching the conversation, she said, "I believe in the open table. I welcome anyone. I love everybody, just like Jesus told us to." And her friend responded saying, "Even Gladys?" And there was a pause, and the woman said back, "Hey, not so much Gladys." And just like for you, and in my telling the story, it was a lighthearted exchange. They were chuckling. But it hit me with a truth in the moment that most people who call themselves Christian understand that love is supposed to be the deal, right? This is not news to us. When you heard that read by Wes, I doubt very few people in the room said, "Oh, love, news to me." So people have heard that for centuries and know that we're supposed to love, and there are sometimes this idea that, well, sure, we love everybody. But loving people generally and generically is not the same thing as loving people specifically. Like Gladys, right? Real live human beings have all kinds of faults and failings, I know I do, and can trigger and challenge others in the sense of wanting to love. And I believe that Jesus is really clear in his teaching and his ministry that he's announcing that there's this reign of God, R-E-I-G-N, reign of God possible, more just, more generous, more joyful, but that the whole thing is driven by love. Love is the essential ingredient for the reign of God to be made manifest. And Jesus also understands that loving real people is not easy. Otherwise, as you heard in the passage, he would not need to command it. Right? When things are easy or come naturally, people don't usually have to command you to do it, right? I mean, I imagine there's some of us that do not need to be commanded to eat chocolate. Or if you are at a sporting event at the University of Arizona, most of you fans don't need someone to command you to bear down, right? It's just part of the deal. It comes easily or naturally. So, by commanding love, Jesus is acknowledging it's not easy. And Jesus, by the way, I know some of us, we might have grown up in churches that seem full of rules, but Jesus wasn't big on commandments. Very few. Love God, body, mind, soul, and strength. Love neighbor as yourself. And John's gospel version of it is what we just heard today. Love one another as I have loved you. Jesus is recognizing that love is not easy, and that it is also, though, essential for living into God's dream and desire for us and for the world. I know sometimes I've been commanded to do things without hardly any help in doing them. I think about the parent who wants to teach a child how to swim, who just throws them in the pool. Right? There's that way of teaching, but there's also the way of demonstrating and being in the pool with the person or the child. Jesus is like the person in the pool with you, not saying, "Love one another," and good luck with that. Jesus right there in and with people, and that's why the commandment that we heard is not just love one another, but love one another how? Did you catch it? Love one another as I have loved you. So Jesus is teaching and sharing and showing, I've shown you how to do this. I've been teaching you how to do this, not just with my words, but my action. Not just love one another any old way, but love one another as I have loved you. And so we look at, well, how does Jesus love people? And we might start with, well, what do we see him do? Well, he does love everybody. No matter who you are or where you are on the journey, Jesus is loving people. the people that were untouchable, the people that were unlovable, the people on the outside, the people on the margins, even the people in power who were scary and threatening. Jesus is loving all of them. And so I think maybe sometimes that's why a lot of Christians have given up on this love business the way Jesus does it, because we think, how could we do that? But Jesus, when we ask, how does Jesus love, we don't just look at what he was doing, but where did he get that love? How do we say, I'll have what he's having? So Jesus also, backing up from what we see him express and embody in the world, we also see Jesus committed to receiving love. And remember, we've talked in the last couple of weeks about this idea of love in the biblical passages is not just a warm fuzzy, but a way we might think about it is committed self-offering. Committed self-offering. It's a choice. So Jesus, experiencing that God is love, commits to offer himself into the flow of that love. We see Jesus early in the morning. What's Jesus usually doing early in the morning? What's he sometimes doing all night? Yeah. And remember, the prayer of Jesus isn't just, now I lay me down to sleep, or our Father who art in heaven. The prayer is the whole way of communing with God. What we might also call meditation or centering or contemplation. It might involve song or chant. And there's times of solitude, but also times in community. Jesus is deeply committed to tapping into the eternal source of love, the eternal source of power, of energy, of life, of possibilities and capacity. Not just when he's scared, not just when he feels like it, not when there's not other things to do, but it is his deepest first commitment. And he's also worshiping in the synagogue and worshiping in the temple. He's sharing in meals with people. He's digging into the scriptures. He's talking. He's listening. Every possible way that Jesus in his time and place could be on the receiving end of love, he does it. He does it. And Jesus also is committed to receiving love from people. Now, I feel sometimes a little bit sad that there's not very many Bible stories of people loving Jesus. I got lots of stories of Jesus loving people, but there's not a whole lot of experiences of people loving Jesus. So one I think of is, it's kind of simple and it's easy to miss, but Peter's mother-in-law. She's healed and then she's serving a meal. This is an expression of her love and her care, her gratitude, but Jesus doesn't say, as sometimes I was taught to say, oh, no, thank you, I don't want to put you into any trouble. The picture is Jesus sat down and ate. He received this gift of love. Or another story that we heard not so long ago, back in Lent, about as Jesus is on his way into Jerusalem, where he's going to face the last week of his life, and there's a woman in one of the stories, she's called Mary, and Mary anoints Jesus' feet with extravagant ointment, wipes it with her hair. It is scandalous to the people there, this kind of love, this expression of love. There's even someone who scolds Jesus for receiving it. And Jesus says, let her be. Jesus lets that love in. And so one of the things we see in Jesus is he keeps receiving in a committed way love in all the ways it comes in. And so Jesus is pretty full of love, right? Operating in ways where then he has an extravagant, abundant love to share. And so he can love the people that others say you're supposed to hate or ignore or forget about. And he loves them in ways that are transformative. Because when you're loved by someone who you don't expect to love you, doesn't it open up something? Right? There's people where I just remember when I was a little kid and I drew a picture for my mom, and she's like, that's beautiful. And I already knew though, and sorry mom, she often worships online. Sorry mom, but I knew it's like, well, she's my mom, she has to say that. Right? We have that part. And it doesn't diminish the love of a mother. I know Mother's Day is next week. But there's the love that will come from the unexpected and surprising places that might open up other possibilities. And Jesus is saying, also love like that. Love in those ways. Because that's the love that has a power to change the story, that has the power to transform the world. And we see it being lived out in the other story you heard this morning from the Acts of the Apostles. So a reminder, this is the story of the Jesus followers after Jesus is no longer physically walking around. And they are experiencing God's continuing revelation and spirit and power, an embodiment of Jesus in them and through them. So physical Jesus of Nazareth, not there, but Jesus, body of Christ, continuing the work. And so they've also been learning, and we're told by Jesus, love like Jesus loves. And they've been doing it. And remember, from the actual gospel stories, a lot of them are kind of lunkheaded, right? Stubborn, confused, afraid, but they keep on keeping on. They keep on this practice of receiving love, of being committed to open to all the possibilities of love, and they get better and better at embodying and extending and expressing that love. So the story today, it's really similar to stories from the last couple of weeks. One that I shared about a woman, a Christian woman in Dearborn, Michigan, risking in ways that she loved her Muslim neighbor. Or a story that we heard last Sunday about the eunuch who in Judaism of the first century was considered other, that he was sexually other, he was gendered as other, because he was not part of the reproducing gender and sexuality that was lifted up as all important in that time and place. And so other, and not allowed to fully be part of the community, not seen as someone who could be part of God's work, but God saw it differently. Remember that from last week? And says, Philip, I need you to help this eunuch know that he can be part of the vine, that he has fruit to bear. Not an other, not an outsider, but part of the vine that Jesus talked about last week. And Philip does it, risks and loves, climbs into a chariot, all of which is like for a first century Jewish guy from Galilee, but he did it all because that's the kind of love that he'd been receiving, and that's the kind of love that he could offer, and that's the kind of love that the eunuch receives and goes down to the court of Queen Candace in Ethiopia, and I'm betting was bearing some good fruit. And so the story today, it's kind of short, but it's an important story. I want to suggest it might be one of the most amazing miracle stories in the Bible. Now, in terms of ways that maybe we've been taught to think about miracles, that they somehow look like magic, right? Woo, water into wine. But miracle in the sense of God at work in ways that break out of the normal ways that we think things operate, this story is one of those stories. So Peter, a good first century Jew, in his story of who he is and who his people are, in the story, in the DNA of that story, they are a people to bless the nations, the Gentiles. That's why God forms this people called Israel in that area and time and place. And there is in the story a sense of you are set apart from the other people, the other nations, what were called the Gentiles, in order to be deepening in your covenant with God and each other. But the idea was never to stay that way. The idea was, it's sort of like going on a retreat. You go on the retreat, you get centered, you get grounded, and then you bring it out into the world. So it was kind of a long retreat, but still, there's this idea that you are being set apart to be grounded and centered so you can bless all the nations of the world. Isaiah says, be a light to the Gentiles. And that was, you can show what covenant with God looks like in community, where you will be more just and generous and joyful and loving. But people forget their stories. People can forget why they exist, what's the purpose, what's the mission. And so a lot of people, in the time and place of Peter, they remember the whole let's be separate part, but not why they were. They forget, many of them, we're supposed to bless everybody part. That's why we exist. That's who we're meant to be. But they focus on the separation, and so you end up with higher walls instead of longer tables. And of course, it happens to every community, right? Why is there a church? It is not to be a like-minded club of friends. I mean, it's great to have friends, but that's not the mission or the purpose. The mission purpose is to do even what Israel is to do, to be a light, to embody God's goodness, love, generosity, to be the vine of Christ, to be the fruit of love and healing in the world. But sometimes it gets bogged down in constitutions and bylaws and meetings and committees. It happens. So what's happening, though, with Peter and the others is they're starting to reclaim the story and how they're living, about why they're here and why they exist. Though it's new, I mean, imagine you've been told all your life, you stay away from those people. And not because they're evil, it's just how it is. You don't sit at a table with them, you don't break bread together with them, and if you, especially if you're going to go do something at the temple, if you even brush against one of them, you have to engage through a ritual of cleansing. And then there's some idea that they're part of you or you're part of them. That's pretty radical. But that's what's happening in this story. So Peter is sharing this good news of Jesus, and there's other Jewish followers of Jesus with him. But then there's these people who are there, who are listening, who are not part of the tribe, who are seen as the outsiders. And while Peter is talking, the Spirit of God comes upon those people. And they're enlivened by the same God that's been at work in the Jewish people. And there's some who's like, you can hear they're surprised, like, what? I thought God was only in our tribe. Right? That's how we get taught, even by example. But what they're seeing is God's burst out of the boundaries and the borders that humans have set up. And then there's the same question that happened with the eunuch on the road to Gaza, who says, is there any reason I shouldn't be baptized? And is there any reason these people shouldn't be baptized? And what was the answer? No, there's no reason. We have lots of stupid reasons to keep up borders and walls and stay separate from people, do we not? But from God's view, in God's eyes, there is no reason. It is our own fear and hatred that does that. But in God's eyes and God's Spirit, those walls fall away. And this is a story where they've broken down. They've been there for centuries. They break down. And they see we are meant to be one. We are together, the same Spirit, same love, same hope, same breath in our lungs. And so for us, we're called to love like that. We are called to love like that. Not just, here's a note that God left on the refrigerator, love your neighbor, good luck, right? But by Jesus, who came alongside people and showed us how to do it, how to be grounded every day in the breath, the Spirit, the healing, the hope, the love of God, to be filled with that love so that we have the capacities and the possibilities to love others across the boundaries and the borders. I was remembering a time I was with a group of people from my church, and there was a serving a monthly meal in a shelter for people who were unhoused. And in the course of that evening, I was talking with one of the staff who was there. And he was sharing some of his story and his experience. He told me that he was in this work because at one point he had been unhoused. And what he had remembered, though, from his experience is most of the helpful people in terms of housing and food were part of churches, were Christians. And he said, I am so thankful that I had shelter, and I'm so thankful that I had food. But he said a lot of those Christians weren't very loving. There would be comments made that we could overhear about us, the unhoused, about us. He was a person of color. And you could tell there was a sense of a suburban superiority, is what he called it. And he said it tinged the food with a little seasoning of shame. And so while he appreciated the food and the shelter, he was not thankful for the shame and the lack of love that sometimes came with it. So he said that's why, as part of the staff team of this particular shelter, he had worked hard and to invite people to set things up differently. He said, so that's why here, you see, we hand at the tables a menu to the guests. And we let people choose from, it's a limited assortment of the food, but what they want. And we serve generously, and we bring the food out to the tables. And we leave a space at each table so that once the people who have served have finished serving, they come with their meal and they sit down at the table. He said, and what I think of when we do that, he said, I grew up in a church in South Carolina, and there was a song that we'd sing. It was called The Welcome Table. I'm going to sit at the welcome table. And that's what I want this to be. Not just as a shelter, but that's what I want my life to be. That's what I want the world to be. And so I'm trying to do that a little bit in my place in this time, to create a welcome table, to love like Jesus taught me to love. May it be so for us all. Amen.